This is going to make so much more sense once I've explained what shutter speed is, and the easiest way to explain it is via a photographic example. Percy, if you're not interested, just be quiet. People are trying to listen to me. Boba Fett is going to try and dive into this swimming pool, no belly flops, and I'm going to shoot this first one at 8,000 of a second, which is as fast as the shutter speed will go. Here we go. With 8,000ths of a second, the amount of time that light hit the shutter was a tiny fraction, which meant we were able to freeze the moment that Boba hit the water. Let's do an extreme other way around, 1 second shutter. So the shutter is going to be open for 1 whole second. I think you can work out what's going to happen. And so you see that image, it looks like it's just a real blur. Shows you the two extremes, really fast shutter speed and really slow shutter speed. As you can see from this photograph, it could be anything. You can't tell it's Boba Fett dropping into the water. It's just this blur because the shutter was open for a second compared to the amount of time the shutter was open for this photograph, which was 1/8,000th of a second, which is a fraction, a tiny fraction of a second, which freezes the moment in time. Now that's fine for photos, but how does this translate into video? What is the right shutter speed for video? It's all about getting the right amount of blur, the right amount of motion blur, which creates a natural movement. So if you look at the photographs, we have the really high shutter speed where things are frozen, and then we have the really slow one where it's just a blur. We need to be a middle ground, and a middle ground is really easy to calculate. So if you're shooting at a frame rate of 25p, it is actually a 50th of a second. If it's 24p, it's 1/48th of a second. If it's 50p, it's 1/100th of a second. If it's 100p, it's 1/200th of a second. If it's 1000p, it's 2000th of a second. I think you understand what it is. Double your frame rate. Video, film, motion pictures, it is that series of still images played together. So with the right amount of motion blur, it plays nice and seamlessly and it feels really natural. You have a too high shutter speed and it's a bit jerky and staccato-like. If the shutter speed is too low, things look ghostly and unnatural. You want the right amount, double your frame rate. These are just rules. They're important to understand so you know when to break them. And one of the ones you might want to break is if you want to go to high shutter speed, because it can give you a really nice effect. It can accentuate action. It's been used in movies. I've used it for my own pieces in this piece here, Portrait of a Boxer. I used it on Festin boxing and punching the bag to give it a real sense of motion. This shutter speed was about 1/500th of a second. You gotta be really careful with your shutter speed, shooting a higher shutter speed, or really shooting any shutter speed which does not sync up to the electricity supply of your country. Here it's 50 hertz. So when you're shooting at 1/50th of a second, it syncs up perfectly. If you shoot at a shutter speed which doesn't match up, say it's a 40th of a second, or 80th of a second, or 500th of a second, you are gonna have issues. You're gonna get flickering and strobing. It's really important to match it up, but only if you are under artificial light. If you're out in daylight, you won't have these issues. And if you're filming under proper TV lights, nice proper lights, you won't have this issue either. It's only under domestic lights. In NTSC regions where the electricity supply is at 60 hertz, your shutter speed ideally will be a 60th of a second, matches perfectly. But you're saying, but I'm shooting 24p or I'm shooting 25p, aren't I supposed to be double my frame rate? Well, ideally for that perfect motion blur, but you could get interference under those artificial domestic lights. So keep it at 1/60th of a second. But Philip, I want to shoot at 50p, I want to shoot slow motion. But you've just told me that I need to have double my frame rate for my shutter speed, which is 100th of a second, but you've also told me I need to be a 50th for the electricity supply, the frequency to match. Well, yes, you can actually have it as a multiple of 2 and it works fine. It won't cause any interference. You can't go any higher because then it starts interfering. And it's the same with 60p. At 60p, you need to shoot at 120th of a second, and under artificial light in an NTSC country, that will be fine. The pain in the arse is, though, that cameras like this, the stills cameras, actually won't go to that. They'll go to 125th of a second, which actually is going to be more or less okay. You should be fine. Proper video cameras, though, will have no issues. We're almost done with shutter, almost. I just need to explain shutter angle. We have this on video cameras, so it is still relevant and it is still useful. And this comes from film cameras where you have a rotary disc as your shutter and there's an angled opening. This spins and lets light in once per revolution to expose each frame. The larger the opening, the slower the shutter speed, all the way to 360 degrees, which is completely open. And we're looking at this in shutter speed terms. This will mean it's the same as our frame rate. So if you're shooting 24p, which you would be for film, that is 1/24th of a second. So the smaller the angle means less light goes in, which is the same as a higher shutter speed. And for the optimum motion blur, where we're talking about shutter speed, it is double our frame rate, so 24p, which would be for film, is 1/48th of a second. And in shutter angle terms, that is 180 degrees. We often refer to this as the 180 degree shutter rule, not the same as the 180 degree crossing line rule, which we'll get to in another episode. Let's not confuse things too much. The last thing about shutter speed is simply the way that video cameras actually capture things. We have a global shutter and a rolling shutter. What does that